Hi, good evening. Good evening, Covenant Woods, and welcome to a Monday night program. Unfortunately, the speaker that we had arranged, he took another job, so he was no longer able to speak for Papillon Park. Is that how you say that word? Papillon Park. So Valentine Museum stepped in, and we have Carrie Leo from the Valentine Museum. Kiri is a volunteer. She's been with the Valentine Museum for over a year. She's been in Richmond for 2. In her past life, she was a teacher, and she also taught software programs. We got a teacher out in the audience, and she taught photography. So we welcome Kiri, and tonight's program is entitled "The Ballot Battle," and it is to highlight the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. This program will profile 5 Richmond points of view and the racial and generational tensions exposed by the fight for women's suffrage. So on that note, we welcome Kiri.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me okay? No? Closer to the mic. All right, and this is new equipment. And then I have plexiglass, so I'm taking the mask off. Is everyone comfortable with that? And probably easier to hear me as well. As Judy said, I'm here with the Valentine. Have any of you been to the Valentine? Yes, good, excellent. So you know a bit about us. We're Richmond History Museum. Started out more as a general museum by a man S. Valentine, who made his fortune selling meat juice. Has anybody here tried meat juice? No, I've been there long enough. Few people who've been with the museum longer than I have said that they have had people come through the museum whose grandparents gave them meat juice. Basically, it was like not a bone broth, because he just pressed slabs of meat, but he cooked it up with a special recipe and sold it as a cure-all tonic that made millions and was sold and produced all over the world. And so he used that money he had purchased the Wickham House, built in 1812, and he used that house and that money to display collections that he had. And so we started off as sort of a Richmond collections museum, and through the years we've been more focused and specifically a Richmond history museum, and doing what we can to tell the story of Richmond from all sorts of perspectives. So tonight's talk, we're going to be talking about, as I said, as Judy said, ballot battle, talking about the 19th Amendment and getting women's right to vote. But before we get to that, here's some photos with the Valentine. There's the meat juice, what it looked like. If you come to our gift shop, you can find even like baby onesies with meat juice label image on it. These are the Valentines here. This is the inside of the Wickham House. And man S. Valentine founded the museum in his will, and so his brother Edward then took over running the museum until his death in 1930. And he was a sculptor. He's done a lot of sculptures, including the Davis sculpture that was on Monument Avenue, and his workshop and everything is on our grounds now too. So here's a little bit of some of the items that we have in our museum. Maps, we have a large collection of textiles and clothing, and lots of activities, both for adults and children, and I do lessons across the age groups for all of them. So, let's get started. Right here we have an image that is a women's suffrage rally at the Virginia State Capitol in 1916. After the Civil War, Richmond had a lot of turmoil, a lot of change after the fall of the Confederacy and the changes that happened after the war, and just a lot of social upheaval in general. And between 1909 and 1920, the advocates for and against suffrage, for women's rights, women's suffrage, petitioned in the ways that they had in those days. They used newspapers, pamphlets, banners, postcards no Facebook or Twitter in those days to be doing presenting their cause. So, as I said, this is an early image of a gathering to promote women's suffrage, and as I said, it's the 100th anniversary. The 100th anniversary was actually in 2020, so we're a year and a half after when it actually happened. Now, so we have a photo here. This photo is actually, image is not specific to Richmond. This is, let me find her name and make sure I tell you the correct name here. Sorry, I'm losing her name. Victoria Woodall. She was in New York and tried to cast her ballot, and it wasn't successful. And then so she went to a committee in Congress, and this is an image of her presenting to that committee, because she tried to cast a ballot in 1871, long before the amendment passed. And Richmond also had its own person. Her name was, sorry, one second. I apologize. Sorry, Anna Bedecker. And so she was the one she came to in Richmond. But this is this is a woman who was in New York, and they founded their argument off of the 14th and 15th Amendments. So the 14th Amendment was stated that blacks were citizens and had equal rights, that African American citizens, and the 15th said that voting rights could not be restricted based on race, color, or servitude, or having been a part of servitude. And so they argued, wait, aren't we women part of this also? And so this is how they presented their argument. And actually, Mrs. Bedecker, her husband was a German immigrant. She invited Susan B. Anthony to Richmond to speak, and others, to try to promote the cause in Richmond. And it went a little slowly. So, mentioned the Valentines already. This is Lila Mead Valentine, and she was the daughter-in-law of Man S. Valentine, who I mentioned earlier, who founded the Valentine, and she was a proponent for women's suffrage. And she and some others created the Richmond Education Association, also founded the Instructive Visiting Nurse Association of Richmond, and also Richmond's Equal Suffrage League, also referenced as ESL, which to me as a former English teacher has another meaning, but at the time that's what ESL meant. And now, so she's doing all of this, she's founding all these things, she's founding the Equal Suffrage League, and her uncle Edward, who I mentioned earlier, who was the sculptor, and her brother-in-law, Henry Valentine, they were on the other side. They were not in favor of women's suffrage. So I imagine Sunday dinner was a little bit interesting in that household. There would have been some great conversations for and against, I'm sure. Now, it's very easy when you talk about history and talk about these folks to only focus on the white Richmonders. But the white Richmonders weren't the only ones who were here. And many of you may know Maggie Walker. She founded the first Black for African Americans. She really promoted within Jackson Ward that it was on citizens to save money, to promote themselves, to build up the community. The bank she founded was called St. Luke's Penny Savings Bank. She graduated from Richmond Colored Normal School, which later became Armstrong High School. And so she really was working to create a stable Black middle class in Richmond. During the Depression, St. Luke's Penny Savings became Consolidated. Well, now it's known as Consolidated Bank and Trust, and then it was acquired in 2005 by Adams National Bank. So once the 19th Amendment was ratified, she really pushed to make sure that African American women were part of that story and part of that history change and being able to have their voice. And we'll come back to some other images in a bit. Any questions so far? All right, then I will continue. If I speak too fast, let me know. Now, this is Mary Mason Anderson Williams. Now, it would be easy to think now, as we're sitting here, that those of us who are female who vote, that of course women would want the vote. But in those days, there were women who were anti-suffragist, who did not think that it was in their interest to have the vote. And this is one of the women who held that view. And so she actually founded and was president of the Virginia Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. And we don't really know a whole lot about how big it was or how successful it was, but it is known that in May of 1918, they were noting the addition of 1,350 new members. So it was a sizable percentage of the female population who was also against the 19th Amendment and adding women's suffrage. So, the start of the movement, in 1909, the Times Dispatch here said, suffragettes here, movement started to organize branch of national order, according to a statement issued, certain women of Richmond were interested in the national suffragette movement. And so this is an early button from the time period and the newspaper article noting that this had happened. So they, a nationally known suffragist, Miss Clay, came and gave a presentation to a small group of women. And it's thought that actually Lila Valentine was who wrote this article so that it reflected what they wanted said. Now, if you notice up here the spelling, it was suffragettes instead of suffragists. And suffragettes comes from England. That's what the term was in England. And American suffragists like to separate themselves because they said, Miss Clay in particular was noted as saying that the suffragettes in England were actually organized against the government to get the women's vote, and that the suffragists in the U.S. were trying to work within the government to make the changes to get voting allowed. So there was a slight difference in names, and at least for the U.S. side, a distinction of what they thought their goals were. Did I see a hand here? Yes. Uh-huh. That would make sense, yeah, and it would make sense that if it was known that that was a derogatory term, that term was not brought to the U.S., that the U.S. Women would try to maybe have a fresh start with terminology.
Would you repeat what any of the audience
yes,
says?
Okay.
Because one thing they don't think they're going to broadcast, and I noticed I was having trouble in the back.
Okay, sorry about that. Do not mind a moment at all. It was noted that in England, suffragettes was a derogatory term, and if you think of like ets as like being something little, and so that suffragettes was not a positive name, and so I was hypothesizing that then would make sense that in the U.S. the women would choose to distinguish themselves from that. Now, as things got moving with this, the Virginia Equal Suffrage League started gaining traction, and more prominent women joined it, including Thomas Jefferson and George Mason's great-great-granddaughters, a few other prominent women of Richmond, Ellen Glasgow and Adele Clark, and nearly 120 members joined in their first year. almost all of them from Richmond, some from the surrounding areas. And as it got more and more successful, that they also had men who joined the group. So it grew, it started to grow. Now we're still not up to 1920 when the amendment passed. So let's see what else happened as we get there. Oh, here we have. All right, so here is a photo of these women that I just mentioned. And I love this photo. I've seen this, I saw this maybe at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture, I think it was. And it's an amazing photo of these women who were all early members of the Equal Suffrage League for Virginia. All right, now I mentioned earlier, not everybody was in favor of it. And so the Virginia Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage also gathered. We talked about that, already mentioned that it was noted that at least 1,300 members had joined at one time period, but not really known, at least as far as the Valentine has been able to find out, not really known how large it was or how many members. There's not been records found. But there were membership cards. It was organized and an organized event. And Mary Masons Williams, whose photo we saw earlier, was one of the, was the spearhead, one of the spearheads of the anti-suffrage movement. All right. So, I mentioned earlier that no Facebook, no Twitter. So, this is some of the ways that there was to get the word out. And so this was social media of the day. And you can see we have here like spirit of 1776. Well, and they said, no, not 1776, spirit of today. No taxation without representation, just using the same vocabulary because women were here and were were part of the community and did not have the right to vote. And so these things were all for and against in the manner that they had of the day. Here's some other things from the time. I don't know if you can really see these very well, but these are actually geared towards not opposing women's suffrage and casting the women who are interested in suffrage in a negative light. It's a little bit difficult to see with this distance and the plexiglass and everything. One quick thing back here. The movements have themes, and there were colors. So the suffrage movement in the U.S. was mostly purple, meaning representing loyalty, white representing purity, and yellow representing hope. Now, in England, the colors were purple, white, and green, but yellow got adopted because Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony used the Kansas state flower, the sunflower, as a symbol during their campaigns. So again, a divergent between England and the U.S. as to subtle differences within the movement. Now, things don't happen in a vacuum. And one of the concerns raised by the Virginia Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage was that if the vote was to allow women to vote, that would include African American women, and that by adding African American women to the rolls, that the country would fall into Negro rule. And actually, I mean, it was a thing of its time, and it wasn't just those opposed to suffrage who were concerned about it. It was also those who were in favor of it. And so this is actually put out by the ESL saying, we want women's suffrage, but here's why it's not going to be a problem. And so they they said that within here, things like, well, we have literacy tests and poll tests, and that will pretty much eliminate the women, the African American women, from voting anyway, so you can give the rest of us the right to vote. So this was a concern of the time, and so it drifted over. It wasn't just issues of gender and sex, it was issues of race as well played into this fight. And interestingly, the African Americans of the time, like the black newspapers in Richmond, did not take a public stand on the issue. They kind of understood that whatever they did would reflect, like if they published in favor one way or the other, that it would backfire. And so they mostly just stayed quiet and let the issue play out. There were a few prominent African American women who were involved in the movement, but in general, the black press stayed out of it because it was tinged with racism as well as sexism. Now, once the amendment passed, we'll get back to Maggie Walker here in a bit. Once it passed, Maggie Walker made sure that it was effective. So, now, this was going on. We're up to 1916 here. Here's a newspaper article that is noting both an article for and against. These women presented to the Virginia Assembly. It was one of the few times that they had presented kind of equally at the same time. So they kept trying to bring it to the General Assembly in Virginia, and it never passed. 3 different times it was presented to the Assembly, and Virginia didn't pass it. Now, and so, a lot of the suffragists were getting very disheartened, thinking, oh, this is going so long, we're not making any headway. But when Britain or England got the vote for women in 1918, there was a little bit of a push and a little bit of excitement that this might continue. But as we got to the 19th Amendment, Virginia was not one of the states that passed it. Of the states, we'll get to it a little bit later about how Virginia played out on this. And so these 2 articles here are about these 2 women, for and against, who were presenting to the General Assembly. And again, not much traction for women's suffrage in Virginia. All right, so this is a photo of a banner that was called the Congressional Union Banner. This is from around 1915 at the Virginia State Fair, and again, just more talk about more trying to get the vote. The National Union. The Congressional Union later became the National Women's Party, and this was a national organization that came to Virginia and to Richmond in addition to the Equal Suffrage League that we've mentioned before. And so the National Women's Party actually did a lot of protests. Like they went to Washington, did more protesting, and the movement kind of split. So you had those, because at the same time, we also had World War I come in. And so it split to those who were like, no, we have to keep protesting now, and we have to keep pushing now. And then others who went, we need to, but right now we're at war, and our primary focus should be to help with the war effort and support the war effort. So there was a divide even within the movement as to how radical, how much to push at that moment given greater events. And so one of the women, so the group that kept pushing, the Congressional Union, as I said, later called the National Women's Party, were protesting, and Pauline Adams, who was president of the Norfolk chapter, was arrested in 1917 and actually ended up in federal prison in Lorton, Virginia, for protesting for women's votes. Now, the other thing that ended up happening is the suffragists decided to take it personally to Woodrow Wilson. And so you can see here, President Wilson, how long do you advise us to wait? And so they kept protesting, and again, like I said, we're taking it directly to Woodrow Wilson to demand an answer from him. And actually, while not supporting it for a while, he then, after the war, put forth a pronouncement that he did support. And what his comment was that we have made partners of the women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not to a partnership of privilege and right? So women's efforts during the war persuaded Woodrow Wilson that women should have the right to vote, and he publicly announced that and gave his support. Any questions so far? All right. Now, this is a headline from June 1919. June 5th, that the Senate had approved the amendment. So it was approved first by the House 2 weeks prior to this, then approved by the Senate, and then it went to the states to be ratified. And at that time, it wasn't called the 19th Amendment, because who knows if it was going to pass. It was just the next amendment, and it was actually called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, which is something I didn't know until I was researching for this. And so now the challenge went back out to the states again. So, so the Richmond Evening Journal reported that the women in Richmond and in Virginia were happy that this had passed. And then in 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the 19th Amendment, and women's suffrage became law of the land. Now, of the states at the time, 36 of the 36 states that ratified, 9 southern states chose not to vote in favor of it, and Virginia was one of them. And Virginia not only wasn't in favor of it, they did not enforce it until it became federal law, and they had no choice. And finally, in February 21st, in 1952, they decided to go ahead and ratify the 19th Amendment and accept that it was there. So 32 years later, Virginia decided to ratify the amendment. So Virginia was not at the forefront of this fight, clearly. So what happened in Richmond, though, was this amendment passed. It became law, and then women then had to register. Well, the women just absolutely bombarded the registrar's office. Women were given 1 month to register to vote ahead of it. And by early October of 1920, more than 13,000 Richmond women had registered to vote, 10,645 white, 2,410 black women. And there were certainly long lines. And actually, on election day, local stores didn't waste any time using this as part of an advertising campaign. And there was actually an advertisement in a newspaper from a downtown department store that said it was for coats for kiddies, with an invitation to stop by when mother and father go voting today. So the stores were quick to jump on the advertising possibilities for this. Now, as I mentioned before, Maggie Walker, who is over here, she was not going to let the African American community in Richmond, the African American women, pass up this opportunity. And so she made sure that the women went to vote. it caused quite a stir, because what you ended up at the registrar's office, there was this 100 days, 30 days, 1 month to register, and so women were going to register, and you ended up with 100 white women mingling with more than 100 colored in the corridors outside the registration offices at the city hall. That could not be. That was not okay. We didn't want that. Like, we already have one chaos that the women are registering to vote. Now we have the chaos that the African-American women and the white women are standing together. So they ended up dividing up the registrar team, and the white women went up to the 4th floor in the building, and the African-American women went to the basement. Now, there still were long lines. The office stays open even an hour later than it's supposed to, and they are literally closing the doors in women's faces. And Maggie Walker was like, come on, get more assistance here. You know, I can do it. These other women can do it. And actually, some women very proudly, it was 2 African-American women who ended up helping register the white women, and a note here about them said, Ms. Wormley and Ms. Jobson distinguished themselves yesterday by registering each of them a greater number of voters than either of the male registrars. Ms. Jobson accepted 193, Ms. Wormley 134. They handled the white women exclusively. Ms. Wormley discovered at the close of the day that her silk vanity bag with a roll of greenbacks and a package of letters had disappeared from the table at which she was working. She expressed the opinion that it had been removed by mistake and added that she knew the person who made the mistake. At a late hour last night, the missing articles and cash had not been returned. So some things never change. Somebody stole her purse from her while she was sitting there registering women to vote. But again, there was a big push. There was a limited period of time. There was a mass registration day where the registrar office was going to have more people, but the women didn't want to wait for that one day and risk that they wouldn't be able to register the vote. So it was this big push. And as I noted before, more than 13,000 Richmond women registered to vote within that month. Now, after the victory in 1920, the Equal Suffrage League disbanded. Its successor was the Virginia League of Women Voters, and began shortly afterwards to make the new vote an informed one. So the League, much as the League of Women Voters does now, it sponsored registration drives, voter education, lobbying efforts, and so that started all the way back in 1920 with the ratification of the amendment. Now, back in 2020, the Valentine had an exhibit with a lot of this information that was here, and so the Valentine was happy to note and to provide a more full story. That is my presentation. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, in the back.
You said the League of Women Voters today. I'm wondering if there's any relationship between the league that was formed then and the League of Women Voters.
I cannot say that I specifically looked it up, but I believe it is. But don't quote me on that as a historical reference. As I understand it, it is, but I did not double check that before coming. Yes. Oh, sorry, and I didn't repeat the question. Is it the same League of Women Voters back then as now, from 1920 to now? And I believe it is, but I don't have the historical notes to be able to say specifically. Yes, sorry.
So they've had a month to register to vote, and then they were allowed to vote in was the election for the president?
Another good question. So they had a month to register to vote, and I did not look up what election it was. But yes, they had a month to vote before that November election, but I did not look up which election it was for.
And that would have been 1920?
It was 1920, yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
So Virginia women could vote even
Once it became federal law, Virginia had no choice. So they did not allow women to vote as soon as the amendment passed. They waited until it became federal law and then allowed women to vote. Yes?
Can you clarify what the current discussion is about the ERA amendment that's going on now, that because it wasn't done by 82?
This is an excellent question. The current discussion on the ERA amendment, and I actually I do not have good information on that. I cannot answer anything specific. I can look it up, I can ask and find out and send the information back if you would like. But as a presentation from the Valentine, we haven't addressed that yet.
I realize it's happened.
It just happened, yes. It's amazing for how long that took. So it was, and that's probably, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment was not the 19th Amendment, because who knows what other amendments might come up before it passed.
The effort in Tennessee resulted in a book called The Woman's Hour, I think, that is very interesting. I mean, that was rough and tumble. The women were physically violent on both sides.
So it's noting that in Tennessee, it was a very aggressive fight, and women on both sides were physically violent. And the name of the book, again, you think is? The Woman Hour, about the fight in Tennessee to ratify. And Tennessee was the ratifying vote for this. Any other questions? I apologize that I haven't gotten as broad yet on this. I don't have as much additional information to be able to provide. I usually like being able to do that, and I haven't been able to this evening. I apologize for that. Anything else?
Well, we thank you for stepping in.
Oh, well, thank you. Thank you for having me. This is enjoyable, and I enjoy doing things like this. So, thank you.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight, and we thank Kiri for being here and presenting this wonderful program. And look forward to having her back to do some of the other programs that the Valentine offers for adults. And thank you for coming down and being in person with us. And if you're watching from home, we appreciate you taking the time to listen in, and we will see you next Monday. So next Monday will be a band called Blue Suede Sun.